You see that they put in really small letters, it says hosted by the enemy greenhouse, and then in tiny, tiny letters, it says the biology department too. Oh my God, come on now, put that a little bit bigger. We need some advertising. So very passionate about that. All right, so this week we're going to continue on with the angiosperms, looking at a little bit more of flower design and the evolutionary process, and then thinking about also getting into pollination strategies and seed dispersal. So I think it's going to map out where this week lectures, and then next Tuesday will be a lecture, but I think that final Thursday's lecture can be a review session for the final exam, or at least most of that period can be for that. So the very last lecture of the semester, if you could come prepared to ask questions, I'm not just going to lecture on and on about the exam stuff. So come prepared to ask questions, and hopefully we can make good use of that time in a review session. All right, so that's the plan. Let's see, so we've been thinking about angiosperms, and so this is another way to depict the life cycle of what's going on with the development of the megagametophyte, the female gametophyte, and then also, so that's being shown on the left-hand side of this main image. So they're showing that process. And then remember, though, that before you can have the megagametophyte development, what's being shown on the far left is like, okay, first we got to get the megaspore mother cell. First, it's reduced to one megaspore mother cell. That now that spore has to go through meiosis and produce 4 cells from meiosis, and then 3 die off, and you're left with a functional megaspore. So then that functional megaspore, all it does is 3 rounds of mitosis. That's it. So it's pretty minimal compared to what we saw with the gymnosperm. So 3 rounds of mitosis, and then you have some migration of the cells going on down the very last lower left image there. And so you end up with 8 nuclei and 7 cells. Remember that 2 nuclei get jammed into 1 cell in the middle, those polar nuclei, right? So then all of that has to happen in the ovules, and then that's when you say, okay, now we have the female gametophyte, the megagametophyte, and now it's ready to get fertilized, and it will go through double fertilization, where once the anther region of the flower that has the microspore mother cells, lots of them, not just one, like in the female, the megaspore mother cell, lots of microspores. Each one will go through meiosis. Each one of those resulting cells can become a pollen grain. All right, so here you see that happening, and then when pollination is occurring, each pollen grain is really 2 cells. It's a tube cell and a generative cell, but no sperm yet. All right, so when pollination happens, it's kind of in the immature state. Hopefully the pollen grain will land on the stigma of the flower. And if everything goes all right, the pollen tube will start to grow and grow all the way through the style, get down to the ovary. And then as that's happening, the generative cell divides one more time to produce those 2 sperm. And then those 2 sperm get deposited into the ovule. And it's a double fertilization where both sperm do something really important. One, of course, will fertilize the egg to give you the zygote, but that other sperm doesn't die like what we saw in gymnosperms. Instead, it goes to the polar nuclei, that cell that has 2 nuclei, and fuses with that. So then, remember what happens when those polar nuclei and the sperm fuse, and then that starts to divide and grow? What does it grow into? Endosperm. And that's absolutely critical because that is the nutrient reserve for the embryo inside the seed. And so once that seed hopefully lands somewhere suitable and starts to germinate, it will be calling on the nutrition in the endosperm to help it get going and get established, because of course it can't immediately do photosynthesis. So it has to have some way to be nourished until it can get its leaves and all the chloroplasts and everything up and running. And then it can start doing its own photosynthetic processes and get some nutrients that way. And then of course the radicle, the embryonic root, is the first thing that comes out with seed germination, because water is so precious. Got to get that water getting into the seed and helping nourish the embryo. Questions on, we've covered this more than once last week. Are there any lingering questions on the life cycle of the angiosperm? Is it tonight? Yeah, so that's probably on the sequence vascular plants. Nice. Yeah, I don't want to stay up too late. Not a good idea. So we were told by an expert that gave a talk to doctors that did some case studies and looked at the data. If you make a midnight deadline, midnight is usually when it gets to, submitted. And they said in general, it's late. So that's due today, and then the other one's due, I think, a week from today. Okay, and then I'm going to post, probably tonight or tomorrow, I'll post the extra credit, and that will likely be due the Saturday before final exam week. Okay. Any other questions? Angiosperms, anything else? Okay. Well, when they look at the development and the evolutionary process of angiosperms, there is some things that they've identified that, they hypothesize has really allowed for the angiosperms to be really, really successful. And they, in terms of their sheer numbers on this earth, they are the most successful group. And so this idea of coevolution with the pollinators, that you have help to get the pollination to occur. And that can be a much more targeted and efficient way to get the pollen to the stigma of the flower. Early on, when they look at the evolutionary process, beetles were probably the most the earliest version of some other entity involved in pollination. We even saw that in the gymnosperm with the needlephytes. It seems like there are some, and with the cycads to some extent too, that beetles might be involved in pollen transfer. And then eventually the more traditional flying insects that you think about, like bees, and then eventually birds, in the evolutionary process came along. And then if you think about it from the plant's perspective, when they're designing their body so that they can get pollination to occur, it really does depend who the pollinator is, how they're going to design their flowers. And so if you're depending on a pollinator that has a very strong visual way of interpreting their world, then you make your flowers bright and showy and flashy to attract attention. And it depends on the pollinator. Like bees see flowers differently with their eyesight than how we see flowers. And I'll show you some pictures of that eventually. But you have this idea of, it's very tailored, like it's this idea of co-evolution, where the plant is advertising to a particular pollinator, and then as they interact with each other over the thousands of years, that gets refined, and each are shifting a little bit, they're evolving in response to each other, so that you have a really good, efficient system, in this case for pollination, okay? And so if you have a situation where your pollinator is very much drawn to odor, then you will evolve to produce odor to keep on attracting that particular pollinator. However, some pollinators don't care about odor, and so we'll talk about that as well. And then eventually, if pollination occurs, which is great, but then the next step is you got to get your seeds dispersed. Once the seeds get made, the fruit gets made, got to have some way for that to get successfully dispersed. You don't want that all the land right by the mother plant, because then you will have too much competition going on. You want to get spread out into new habitats. So also another thing that they look at to say, why are the angiosperms so successful? It's a lot of these adaptive traits that they've refined over the thousands and thousands and thousands of years. Their leaves, most leaves are pretty tough, especially with all the, remember all the cells have cell walls, and so in the xylem will have secondary cell walls. So you have that physical toughness with the cellulose. You also can see that they adapt really well to their current habitat and will respond to that. So they can morph their leaves in response to their environment to better survive. In this case, they can go reduced in size for cold and drought. In the desert environment, they tend to get fleshy, but not too big. And some of their leaves in the desert environment get all the way reduced into fines. So you have a lot of these adaptive traits that they've evolved in response to just their habitat is pretty amazing. And then thinking also in their leaf tissue, that's where so much of the secondary metabolites are present and are there to help defend themselves. So you have physical defense, chemical defense. Remember too, now when we think about vascular tissue, they actually point to this as a really strong mechanism that has helped the angiosperm be so successful, is the presence of vessels in their xylem. So they have tracheas and vessels. The vessels are the wider diameter for water and mineral transport through the body. And that wider diameter, if you do the physics calculations, calculate the efficiency of vessels compared to tracheas, it's really efficient to have that wider diameter. So they say that's made them very successful. And then they have very well developed sieve tube elements in those companion cells. That is a really good strategy as well. Their seed coats, even though they might look thin to our eyes, when we look at a seed, those seed coats are very protective. And having, fruit tissue is also an adaptive trait that is allowing for really good seed dispersal. So all of these that are listed out, really good ideas in terms of, thinking about the question, how come the angiosperms are so successful and spread around the planet so widely? So this, just getting you to think about this evolutionary process here, it's put into a phylogenetic tree, and they're showing some of the traits that you're seeing as you work your way so the basal angiosperms are the more ancient angiosperms. They're earlier on this line. And then as you follow this line off up to the right, you can see that you're getting into the monocots and the dicots. Often dicots get referred to as eudicots. The EU means true dicots. So we tend to shorten it down to dicots. So, but just be aware. And then you can see some of the things that are happening along the evolutionary timeline that they're tracking in the fossil record. And so this is trying to put it into perspective of, millions of years of the evolutionary process. What do we see happening that allows for this speciation to occur into the different groups? So here, this table is looking at the basal angiosperms. So going back to these three here coming off the line on the phylogenetic tree. Then here, the magnolids is the second column. And you can see that showing up here as well. And then you can see that off this magnolid line, you see the shoot off to the monocots. So they're closely related. Let me go to this. Okay, so they're showing the characteristics of all of those. And then the eudicots, they're showing that's where you shoot off to the far right on this phylogenetic tree. So looking at this phylogenetic tree and then this table, you know, flipping back and forth as you're studying, you can start to piece together and see these different characteristics among these different groups. A lot of this we've covered already in terms of, especially with the monocot versus dicot, what makes them different from each other with the, you know, the one aperture, one opening in the pollen for a monocot, 3 for a dicot. Okay, so this is a useful table to get you thinking about the evolutionary process. So I'm going to start talking more about this now in some of the remaining slides. So this is like the one-stop shopping table for you to study off of, but then the slides moving forward here, we'll start talking about these criteria. So here you're looking at an example of a dicot seed that just germinated out of the ground, the seedling. And then at the end of its life, you see the flower production there as well. So dicots tend to have the 2 cotyledons in their young stages of development. When the seed germinates, you might not always see the cotyledons. They might be buried under the soil, but they usually have 2. And then when you look at the flower parts, especially if you count the flower petals, I find that the easiest way to look at it, because usually that's the biggest part of the flower. Flower parts are usually in multiples of 4 or multiples of 5. And so here you're seeing 5 petals. And I think if you zoom in and look at the stamen, the anther and the filament, the stamen, you would see 5 of those too. But sometimes it's hard to see depending on the photograph. So if you're in doubt, if someone points to a plant and says, do you think that's a monocot or dicot? Choose dicot, because most angiosperms are dicots, 80%. So very successful to be a dicot. Trees and shrubs are dicots. Many herbaceous species that are done in one season are also dicots. We looked at leaf tissue a while ago and said dicots have netted venation. They look like a fishing net when you look at the vein pattern. And the pollen tends to have 3 apertures or openings. So those are all characteristics of dicots. And a lot of this you've heard already. Monocots, 1 cotyledon, typically. And then flower parts in multiples of 3. That's pretty consistent. And again, I usually zoom in on the petals of the flower. A lot of herbaceous plants, and then the so-called non-woody trees. So palm trees, technically they don't form any secondary xylem. Secondary xylem is wood, so that's why they say non-woody. There's not any secondary xylem. Monocots don't form wood. Remember, we looked at that stem tissue portion of the semester. We looked at stems. So Joshua trees, palm trees, they have non-woody stem tissue. They're monocots. They just have vascular tissue that's scattered in the stem. Their leaves have parallel venation. Sometimes it can be a little fancy, but in general, it's a parallel venation pattern. And then usually just 1 aperture for the pollen opening. So here is a comparison of monocot on the left, dicot on the right. So, excuse me, please think about these criteria. Certainly we'll be asking about this on the final exam, looking at what makes a monocot, what makes a dicot. And so these are the criteria that we point to for that kind of answer. Here you can see the stem tissue where the monocots have that really scattered vascular tissue. There's no vascular cambium that leads to increase in girth, you know, the secondary xylem. But with the dicots, you have that ring of vascular tissue. And then that vascular cambium is busy making xylem bone through the whole life. All that xylem starts to accumulate as secondary xylem, and the diameter of the stem gets bigger and bigger. Here, another criteria that you should be aware of, monocots tend to have what we say fibrous roots. So there's no obvious taproot. The fibrous roots look pretty similar in diameter to each other. But dicots tend to have a persistent taproot through the life of that plant. Large, obvious taproot, and then smaller lateral roots as well. Okay, so that's something new to think about. Everything else on here we've already talked about. Here's another depiction of monocot versus dicot. So again, just another way to look at it. Okay, so then let's think about flower design over the evolutionary process. There's some key things that they have ascertained by looking at the fossil record primarily of flowers. And they find that the older, more ancient flowers, they tend to have numerous parts to the flower. And they are often attached to the center of the flower, usually the female part of the flower. And when you look at how they're attached, it's in a spiral arrangement. As you look down, you can see this spiral pattern of how things are attaching. Usually it's the stamen that are attaching that way. You see everything though kind of separate. There's no fusion of any of the flower parts. Everything is very distinct. You have distinct stamen. You have distinct pistils, petals. Everything's very distinctly separate. And lots of them typically. Lots of petals, lots of stamen. This radially symmetrical idea is when you look down on the flower, no matter which way you were to cut it in half, the two resulting halves would be mirror images of each other. So it doesn't matter which way you cut it, you're going to have mirror images. So that's what radially symmetrical means. And then the ovaries are superior. They're sitting on top of the rest of the flower part. So that's the more primitive ancient features. And then as they tracked the fossil record and started seeing the progression of evolution, what they started to see over time is that flowers started to become less fancy in the sense that they don't have as many parts to the flower. Some of the more really advanced flower designs, they even fuse some of their flower parts, like the leaves, the petals will get fused, for example, and we'll talk more about that. This idea of a compound pistil, which just means that you have fused carpels. So again, the carpels get fused. And then the bilateral symmetry. So this picture on the lower right, there's only one way you can slice that flower in half, and it's like top to bottom here where my laser pointer is going. That's the only way you can slice it in half in order to get the two resulting halves to be mirror images. So we're bilaterally symmetry. There's only one way to divide us in half to get mirror images. And then you see this shifting of where the ovary shows. And in the most advanced flowers, it's inferior ovaries. So they've sunk the tissue down and the other parts of the flower are attaching toward the top. And then you tend to see sepals that will cover the flower bud. That's the one that's the most notable, really. And then when the flower buds and opens up, the sepals kind of peel away and you see the actual flower petals and the rest of the flower. Okay, so this image that you're seeing on the top right is ancient. That's a magnolia flower. We have in town here a few spots where I can locate magnolia trees. Love to go visit them in the spring. There's one in the 7th Street Cemetery. And then I've found some on, I don't go to the ones in people's yards because that would be trespassing, but there's one on the 7th Street Cemetery. There used to be one at the Upper Harbor right by like where you walk onto the docks, and they cut it down. So disappointed. So the one you can publicly go to is in 7th Street Cemetery. Beautiful, beautiful flowers, very ancient species. And then that lower image was of an orchid. So here is a drawing just trying to show ancient versus advanced and some ideas here. And so lots and lots of pistils, lots and lots of stamens in the magnolia, quite a fair bit of petals, okay, superior ovary. And then shifting, you see far fewer parts. Parts are getting fused, the ovaries getting shifted to be inferior. And so orchids are considered to be one of the most advanced, evolutionarily advanced plant and their flowers. So again, this shifting going on. They think it did allow for better protection of the very precious ovary with the ovules and the eggs and everything that has to happen just right once you get the sperm produced there or sent there. So good strategy. Here's the bilateral on the right versus radial on the left. They're trying to show that any way you cut it with radial, doesn't matter, you'll get mirror images. You don't need to know actinomorphic, just radial versus bilateral is how I refer to it. You don't need to know the fancy words. Okay. There's been some healthy debate over the years of how did the flower originate and evolve, and most plant biologists would probably tell you leaves is coming from leaf tissue that have been modified. And I think that makes a lot of sense looking at the data. There are a few that say it might be actually stem tissue. And then the petals are actually the only thing coming from leaves. So I think most people are falling into the first bullet point that all of it is coming from leaf tissue. But just be aware there's still some debate. What they think happened is that the petals are actually evolving from stamens, which are the male part, that phased out their sporangium tissue. So they lost that role as having sporangia and the microspores inside. They lost that role and instead took over the role of advertising, having some petals to be flashy and show up. And so they think that that kind of makes sense, because remember, when you look at a perfect flower, you have the male part surrounding the female. So, and then the petals are right there, right next to the male part. So it kind of makes sense that it's the male part that might have given up some of that role to become petals. And then over time, the more advanced flowers, like the orchids, you see petal fusion going. And sometimes it'll fuse into a tube, so they call it a tubular corolla. The main thing I want you to get from it is fusion of parts. That's a characteristic of more advanced flowers. And then often what you see is that those petals are fused, and then the stamens, the male part of the flower, also get fused with the corolla. And so it's they're kind of really simplifying the flower design and getting a little bit more efficient, I guess. So this is a visual of what they're thinking of when it comes to really ancient flowers that had stamen, the male parts just kind of sitting on the surface of a leaf. And then as you work your way off to the right, they're trying to show how that very ancient design could have evolved over time to get you the male portion, the stamen. Remember, the stamen consists of the anther, and then the filament is the stalk that holds the anther upright. And so they have pretty good fossil evidence to demonstrate this kind of progression. And then here is a leaf, an ancient leaf with the female parts, okay, the pistil, which consists of, mostly here you're looking at pretty much just stigma tissue, and the ovary is buried in there. And then you see this shift of a much more distinct stigma style in ovary over time. And so the stigma gets kind of reduced and set up onto the top, and then it's supported by the the style, and then the ovary with the ovules inside, and eventually the eggs show up there. So they do have some fossil evidence to show this kind of progression. It's really kind of cool to see all the progress they've made at looking at that evolution of the flower. So this image is just trying to get you to, realize that there are lots of designs to flowers. There's some key things I want you to know. So what I have in text here, the perfect flower, I want you to know what a perfect flower is. And so perfect means that there's both male and female parts to the flower. It's all in one flower. So perfect flowers, the fancy way to say that, androecium is all of the male parts, gynoecium is all of the female parts. Okay. If it is an imperfect flower, that means it's either a male flower and just has the male parts, and then you're going to have a separate female flower, that same species. So they separated the sexes to two different flower types. So then we say it's imperfect. And then this last category, inflorescent, is many flowers, often small, clustered together. So when you take a look at them in total, they look like one big flower. And lots of people are fooled by that. They'll say, oh, look at that flower. But when you look more closely, it's a lot of flowers that are arranged in a very particular pattern. Yes, so monoecious, and I think it's in a slide coming up, or maybe in the next slide, but monoecious means one house. So if you're thinking about an imperfect flower design, and you say, oh, it's a monoecious species, what that means is on one plant, you're going to have male flowers and female flowers, one house. And then if you say, oh, that's a dioecious species, that means you have a male version, male plant with male flowers, and then you have a separate female plant with female. And we'll talk about that because that starts to play into how does pollination happen, how do species ensure that they get good mixing of genes during the sexual reproduction. So we'll get into that. So those three categories that are on this, perfect, imperfect, and inflorescence, I do need you to know what that is all about, okay? And so, for example, the sunflower in figure C, that is an inflorescence. Sunflowers are actually multiple small flowers clustered together in a very particular way that to our eye, we just say, oh, look at that flower, but it's actually many flowers. And then also the pineapple, that's an inflorescence. And then here, B, you can see that that flower, that looks like a lily they've designed, is a perfect flower. It has both male and female, okay? The other one is kind of hard to see what's going on, but here's some examples of inflorescences. And you can see the designs vary quite a bit. I'm not asking you to know these words on this slide other than inflorescence. What does that mean? But just be aware if you buy a field guide to the angiosperms, like if you buy Midwest angiosperms, and you start flipping through that, they start using these terms. Like they'll ask you, does the flower, is it a raceme or a panicle? So that's how they get you to try to identify what you're looking at when you're hiking around and trying to figure out what kind of plant this is. So this would become important if you want to do that kind of thing. I guess the only other word that you might see showing up quite frequently are catkins. And a lot of people don't realize those are flowers. They don't look like much. If you looked at, especially in the spring here with some of the tree species, you'll see these catkins hanging off the branches. And sometimes they're even hard to spot unless you're really paying attention. But those are the male flowers. And they look very, very different compared to when you normally think of the word flower. They're just not showy or conspicuous. All right. So there's two major families that I'm going to mention, the Orchidaceae and the Asteraceae. These are really large families in the sense of how many species of plants belong into each of those. They're really big family groups. And so let me just say a few things about them. With the Asteraceae, these are the types of plants that when they produce their flowers, you'll see this pattern of an inflorescence where you're going to have in the middle the so-called disc flowers, and then surrounding the disc flowers will be the so-called ray flowers that usually have the petal as part of its flower design. And so when you look at that type of ray flower, sometimes they're totally sterile, like they're just for show. There's no male or female part. If there is a female part to the ray flower, it is typically female, not always, but typically. And then if you think about sunflowers, if you've ever grown sunflowers, you may have noticed that's when you can really tell it's a group of flowers, because the sunflower all those flowers will mature at in sequence, essentially, over the summer season. And it is usually in a spiral fashion to start to see these flowers maturing and showing up in the sunflower. And so I really encourage you, if you get the chance to grow, you know, they make dwarf sunflowers now, so you don't need a ton of space to grow a sunflower, but it's really fun to see the development of the flowers. And that really does convince you, oh yeah, this is a bunch of little flowers all clustered together. It's an inflorescence because they stagger when those flowers start maturing. So here they've done a little bit of a dissection on a sunflower, and you can see here with the disc flower in the center that forms kind of that brownish central region. You can see here that it's a perfect, those are perfect flowers where you have male and female parts in the center. And then the ray flower are the ones that are in the periphery and actually have the actual flower petal to catch the eye of the pollinator. And you can see here, it's just female in this case. But you take those all together, when you look at a sunflower, I can understand why people say, oh, look at that flower as a single thing, but it's really flat. Here's a real one dissected. So again, you can see all the flowers that make up that central portion, the disc portion, and then the periphery. So really, really fun. By the way, the seeds that will form in the head region, the disc region, over time, if pollination occurred, you'll also see the fruit formation, essentially, also in a spiral fashion, where you see the seeds show up in a kind of a staggered routine over the rest of the summer. Okay, and then a big comparison, a shift in how these flowers look compared to what we just talked about. Orchidaceae. It's kind of hard to appreciate when you are in this area of the world in the Midwest because we don't have a lot of orchids here, unfortunately. We have a few, but they're really the largest angiosperm family. They're the most successful if you count number of species as, you know, the success of that group. And so over 24,000 different species. And most are tropical or subtropical. And then when you get into the tropical regions, most of them are epiphytes. They grow, they sit on branches of trees in the tropical forest, and they don't harm those trees. They're epiphytes, they don't harm the plants. They're just using the branches as a way to get up off the ground and get better access to sunlight. Orchid seeds are really bizarre. In fact, I often scratch my head why they would come up with this strategy of producing seeds that are virtually like dust specks. No endosperm, no cotyledons that have any significant nourishment. There's very little nourishment in those seeds, and I don't quite get that. And I've been looking for an answer from an evolutionary plant biologist why that strategy would get, and it's across all the orchid species. It's not like just a few do that. And I still don't have an answer to that. I'm going to keep searching. But remember, I mentioned it earlier, these seeds, they need the help of a fungus in order to germinate and grow. And if you don't have the right pairing, it's a very specific pairing. And if you can't get that to happen, the seeds won't germinate. And yet they are the largest family of plants. So they're successful. It's just kind of stunning that they are so successful. All right, so when you look at their flower, the so-called column area, and I'll show you a picture of this. It has a stamen, so that's the male part, and it's actually fused to the female part. So you get fusion of the male and female parts in that region of the flower. And then the petals aren't all identical. You have 3 petals typically, but 2 of them we call the wings. And then the last petal has really morphed into what we call the lip. And it often is morphed into a cup-like shape. Okay. And then surrounding those petals will be 3 sepals. Those are the parts of the flower that look most leaf-like. They're typically green, and they are protecting the orchid flower before it buds and opens. And then remember, they have bilateral symmetry, only one way to cut them to get mirror images. And then orchids, when you look at the plant when it's first germinating and saying, you know, how is it getting its nutrition? There are actually some species that can be saprophytic, which means as soon as they are germinating, and again, they need the help of a fungus, but they can be sopping up nutrients from around them to sustain them for a while before they get their photosynthesis going. With usually, you know, the fungus has to be there too, but and it just depends what species. So it's kind of amazing that they are so successful in terms of how many species have evolved. So here's a visual of the orchid flower where you can see the column region in the center that has both the male and female parts fused, okay? And then this spotted one, that's the lip. That's one of the petals that you morphed into the lip or cup-like shape. And then there's only two other flower petals, the two petals shooting off to the left and right. And then the ones that you see behind that, the three, what look like the petals, those are actually the sepals. And in orchid, it's pretty standard that the sepals will be the color of the petals, which is a little unusual because most other sepals stay green until, you know, and then they peel apart and stay green when the flower emerges out of that. Here we see that the sepals have kind of taken over the role of not only protection when the flower hasn't budded yet, but also advertisement. When it all blooms, those sepals help out with advertising. So flowers in the orchid family can be tiny, 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 and even underground. There's some orchids that bloom underground. They're really small. And then you get some that do many, many or wide. Yes. Yeah. Think about the flower design. So some orchids, I mean, these are all orchids. And if you start looking at them closely, they look like, to our eyes, other things. Like over here, don't those look like ducks in flight? The top left. Isn't that bizarre? It's actually called the duck orchid. This one is called the vampire orchid because this looks like a vampire face with fangs coming off. This one is called the dove orchid. It looks like a dove in flight in the center. This is the monkey orchid on the lower left. The white egret orchid in the middle there. And then they call this one the naked man orchid. So really bizarre designs. And of course, these aren't, I mean, the orchids aren't evolving a duck looking flower to attract ducks. And that's not, there's no correlation there. This is just through, a lot of this is done through selective breeding by humans, how we get these really interesting different designs. The orchids, you can get addicted to orchids if you let yourself. It is amazing. They're such a fascinating group of plants. Here on the left is one of my favorites that I've owned. This one is called the chocolate orchid because it actually exudes the scent of chocolate, and I love chocolate. So during the day, it pumps out this very lovely odor of chocolate. My whole house smells like hot chocolate, essentially. And then it stops producing it at night. That fooled me because when I went to pick it up from the florist, it was like 7 at night. And I took it into the car and I took a big sniff and I couldn't smell anything. I'm like, they sold me a dud. And I was getting all cranky about it. And then I thought, well, I'll take it home. But then the next morning I woke up like, what's that smell? And it was the chocolate orchid. So just be aware that if they describe it as having this or that scent, it might only do it during the day or only at night, depending on the orchid. But they can be incredibly ornate and beautiful. The one on the right here is what you see most commonly sold to just the ordinary person. That they sell this a lot, like, you know, Walmart, Target, and so on, because some orchids, you have to have a decent amount of knowledge to keep them going and keep them happy. And you have to have very particular living conditions, especially humidity. has to be just right. And I had to give up my orchid and donate it to the greenhouse because this chocolate orchid, because it didn't like our winter humidity and I couldn't keep my house humid enough. So Phalaenopsis is the one being shown on the right. Still really, really beautiful. I've had one in my kitchen that has been blooming since last spring, and it's just now dropping its last bloom. So almost a full year of blooms. That's the healthiest Phalaenopsis I've ever had. And so those are pretty easy to take care of. They're more for the people that live in this area that have low humidity. They're pretty tolerant. So, but there's all kinds out there. I think the nearest big city that has orchid, like huge conferences where people come and sell all their orchids, and it's in Chicago in the spring. I think it might be around spring break. I don't know, but if you ever get a chance to go to it, I have yet to do that. I plan to get there soon, but you can see all kinds of different orchids and just gorgeous, gorgeous designs and very bizarre. So we're going to ask you to watch one more video by Sir David Attenborough on pollination strategies, and he does talk a fair bit about orchids and how wily they have become over the years in terms of how they have co-evolved with their pollinators. So, all right, we'll stop there and continue on with some of these traits next time.